Thanks everyone for joining today's Space Syntax Lab seminar. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Julie Zook here. She will be speaking about her research on how the spatial design of healthcare facilities influences care team communication. Julie is an associate professor of architecture in the School of Architecture and also at the Carl Illinois School of Medicine at the University of Illinois. Her work sits right at the interface of medicine and architecture, and she is also the co-editor, together with Professor Kirsten Saylor, of the open access book, The COVID Life of Hospital Architecture, which uses sociospatial analyses to identify design principles that can improve patient safety, support collaboration, and strengthen wayfinding. And before I hand over to Julie, if you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the chat so we can address them at the very end during our Q&A. And with this, I'd like to hand over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Kamon. I also want to thank you for the opportunity to speak in this seminar and you and the Space Syntax Lab. So I'll be talking primarily about two papers where the results of the study, the results of the research are published, but I'm also going to talk about the prequel and some ways I was involved in the design process that led to the spaces we would ultimately study. So when I initially planned this talk, I provided an abstract that discussed the use of an evidence-based design process for inpatient ward design in the US. And I am glad to share that story, but I'm also kind of troubled by a term that I elected to use, evidence-based design. Evidence-based design is kind of a funny one. Is it desirable? Is it even possible to conduct such a generative, iterative, and synthetic activity as design in the manner of an evidence-based process? So in the wild, as we see it out in practice, evidence-based design seems to act as a shorthand for design processes that engage research. But I think probably many of us here know that the quality and the quantity of scientific research about the built environment, and especially the architectural scale, is limited. And this undermines the idea that design could be evidence-based in the same way that medicine, for example, could be evidence-based. Let's see. There we go. For the purposes of this talk, I'm using evidence-based to get at a broad idea, and it's the idea that a person who intends to intervene on the world ought to have true beliefs about the world. So in addition to the idea that true beliefs have inherent value, it's also reasonable to think that designers can make better design decisions if they have the benefit of true beliefs that are relevant to the kinds of decisions they have to make. From this point of view, probably the best working example of evidence-based design that we have in architecture is the design of architectural structures. And this is because in architectural structures, we infer our design principles from laws, and we know the laws to be sound, and they're well accepted, and we can infer from them in ways that are flexible and creative. So nobody says, I don't need a structure, it's not relevant, because we have such good laws around how statics work. That said, sometimes designers who are about to intervene in the world could benefit from true beliefs about how people carry out activities in built environments. And regarding this, we don't have laws, and we have kind of the barest of theories. Not so many theories, not so well validated, not so well understood. But nevertheless, it is here that I hope to be of some small benefit. I want to begin by talking about the work of nurses. Nurse work can be misunderstood as service industry work. And in such a model, we might tend to focus on efficiency and on emotional labor as central. And we might conclude that the main thing the built environment can do for nurses is to do things like minimize travel distances. And this is an idea that's been around for at least a century. So you can see the Nuffield Trust studies in the function and design of hospitals on one side to the right, very concerned with the conservation of nurse movement and effort. And on the other side to the left, very concerned with the allocation of square footage to useful and productive aspects of hospital architecture. So nurse step efficiency is not wrong-headed, but it doesn't exhaust the issue of how to design for nurse work. And in the meantime, in working with hospital management, I've often heard nurse talking described as problematic, as though nurses talk instead of working. Nurse work in the US has historically been understood as fundamentally women's work, as fundamentally gendered. And this is probably not unrelated to the popular conception that nurse communication is annoying or impertinent rather than a legitimate part of nurse work. Susan Reverby has an excellent history of nurse work in the US called Ordered to Care, and she talks about how nurse work was conceived as fundamentally feminine, and thus you didn't really need to pay for it, and it was also okay to like throw housekeeping or janitorial tasks in with it. And so this is the history that we're freighted with when we start to talk about what should nurse workspace be like. Nurse work actually consists of a range of activities in providing and coordinating patient care. That's sort of the definitional dimension of nurse work. Patient surveillance is a really important part of nurse work, but so is nurse communication and collaboration. And over a series of studies, my colleagues Michelle Osman, Kirsten Saylor, who's here today, and Rosie Pakulova have demonstrated that nurses work under attention, of keeping their eye on the patients, while at the same time staying connected to the care team. And quite literally, this can pull them into opposite directions. Nurses need face-to-face communication with other care staff so that they can form social bonds that support quality work, also so that they can have unplanned communication on issues as they arise, and also for purposes of implicit learning. And implicit learning is learning by being part of things instead of by receiving explicit directions. Lapses in care team communication are the leading root cause of medical errors. So when things go wrong, when someone gets the wrong medicine or they get food and they're not supposed to, more often than anything else, it's a failure to communicate. So hospitals and architects should arguably be really thinking about designing to enhance and promote nurse team communication. So how nursing work is accommodated in hospital architecture is from team stations or teamwork areas called nurse stations. When hospitals were dominated by open wards, the nurse stations were in the wards with the patients. And as hospitals began to enclose private and semi-private rooms, nurse stations came to be strategically located in corridors, often situated so they would have a good view into patient rooms or at least in the direction of patient rooms. So if nurses are at once trying both to surveil patients and stay connected to the team, then some patient rooms are better and safer than others by virtue of their proximity and visibility from the team station. So the rooms that are closest to the nurse station are safer, and you can't have them all closest to a team nurse station. So about 20 years ago, we saw the emergence of a strategy to reduce this kind of disparity between patient rooms, and this is the decentralized nurse station. Decentralized nurse stations are small work surfaces, usually positioned between pairs of patient rooms. And the idea was that the nurses could work close to the bedside of their assigned patients rather than clumped in a group potentially farther away from those patients. The purported benefits of decentralized stations include that they reduce nurse walking, they reduce the noise of nurse conversation, which can be a problem for patients, and they support more nurse time at bedside. There are real problems with on-unit noise that prevents patients from sleeping and hinders their recovery. But the idea that nurse work should consist of less walking, less talking, and more serving misses completely that a massively important part of what nurses do is exchange knowledge. And that no one else on the unit holds and exchanges vast and dynamic stores of implicit and explicit knowledge like nurses do. So sending them down the corridor to sit near the patient is not entirely a good idea from this perspective. And we have some empirical studies showing that when you have only decentralized nurse stations, communication has problems diffusing. It has to go through a lot of steps to move through the unit, whereas when you have a team station, it seems to diffuse a little more directly. For several years, I had a really active design research consultancy, and BSA Life Structures was the firm that I worked with the most. They were starting an inpatient vertical tower expansion. So they were just building new floors on top of an existing patient tower. And they asked me to write up a quick synopsis of the literature on inpatient unit design. So I did that. And then they came back and said, actually, we've been talking to nurses on the current unit, and they feel like they can't find or talk to each other very easily. And they would like this pervasive disconnection to be something that's addressed in the design of a new unit. So this was the way a specific design challenge came to us, to BSA and to me. This is the plan that the nurses were talking about. This is a 2004 plan, so it was kind of around the time the decentralized nurse stations became a thing that people talked about, and they were really enthusiastic about pushing those nurses to bedside everywhere and getting rid of every centralized station except for one. So the red circle there, the unit entry is from plan left, and so there's one team nurse station where the unit clerk sits and the charge nurse sits, and then the rest of the nurses are are meant to sit out near their patients. So this is a 32-bed unit, and there's 4 subunits of 8 beds that are centered on the corners. So none of them really had a proper nurse station to sort of centralize to where they worked. You'll also notice this kind of rhomboid shaped plan. And it's got these funny orthogonal spurs going off the ends, and each of those have 2 patient rooms in them. So those patient rooms are a little odd in that they're not off the main corridor. So obviously the absence of a team station for every sub area on the floor is part of what's dampening communication and awareness between nurses. But this is a vertical tower expansion, and so not very much was going to be changed. We had to keep the same footprint, the same plumbing, the patient rooms were going to be in the same place. There's toilet rooms in every patient room. This is typical in the US. So a lot was locked in. What could be changed was mostly the core, which is this central area. And typically in the core, you have storage, various spaces that support nurse work, and building systems. So the design team at BSA came up with 2 alternatives that they brought back to the client. And either way, they were going to route a new corridor through the core, and they were going to add 4 new nurse stations, and they were going to keep a lot of decentralized stations for sort of a redundancy. The question was whether the team stations should be at the midpoints of each corridor, and that is the diagram on the right, or if they should be at the intersections. And in principle, both schemes are obviously an improvement, and the design team and the client didn't have a basis for picking between them. They both kind of seem to have some decent logics to support either one. So I did a quick space syntax analysis. For those of you who work or have experience in the design professions, you're familiar with the speed at which decisions have to be made. You're probably familiar with, good morning, and you need an answer by lunch. And that was the kind of condition under which I ran this quick analysis. This was not a well-considered research question, planned carefully in advance, but it was much more, well, a decision is going to be taken soon, and some analysis is better than no analysis, probably. So you can see I didn't even post-produce the images or clean them up or anything like that. This was like working space syntax. So what we saw, I have the corner station scheme on the left and the midpoint station scheme on the right. The corner station scheme was like a little bit better integrated overall, but the numbers are nearly identical. However, in terms of the average viewshed size, which we might call VGA connectivity, from the software point of view, I'm going to just be calling it viewshed size. It was larger on the new unit than on the old unit. And this was sort of, consistent with the literature we're working from. A more integrated unit will give nurses a sense of being able to more easily see and find other people. Again, big caveat because the difference is kind of small. A unit with larger viewshed sizes, it stands to reason that it would help nurses see each other more easily. And they were sort of complaining in this ineffable way, like, I can't see people, I don't know where people are. But so we're a little bit leaning toward the corner station scheme at this point. And then I did a really quick stepped-up analysis from the area of the team nurse stations and just looked at how many of the decentralized nurse stations that were picked up by that. And that was sort of a third analysis in favor of the corner stations the corner station scheme. So there's an improvement in the specific defined visual connections between these points that are relevant to nurses being able to find each other. Their work areas could see each other. And this is, again, real relevant to the subunits, the quadrant subunits that the plan breaks into. Finally, we have these pairs of projecting rooms and those orthogonal stubs. And I felt a lot more comfortable that there was better proximity to the protective force of nurse presence for those rooms in the corner station scheme. Otherwise, they would probably fall kind of badly out of awareness in the midpoint station scheme. It's that issue of trying to cope with the disparity of visibility that different patient rooms have. So my BSA colleagues were like, that makes sense. They took the analysis back to the client and together they decided on the corner station scheme. It was built, it was opened around the start of the COVID pandemic, and I thought that was it. But as COVID hospital admissions eased, we began to hear back from the hospital that the nurses felt like the old unit, the floor below where the new one was built, and the new unit were really fundamentally different places to work in terms of how they felt. So we decided to go back and study the two units, and this is how the research question came to us. Okay, so for each unit, we wanted to examine some key features in the design that might be relevant to nurse communication, especially the kind of layout properties that we looked at during the design process. And then we were also going to assess communication on each unit. The new unit, which is the topmost floor, is on the left in the slides, all the remaining slides of this. And we have the introduction of 4 team stations, and we have the second corridor through the core. Nurses on both units have Vocera, which is a mobile nurse call system, so they can communicate when they're not, co-present with one another. And both units have enough decentralized stations for all their staff. So from one perspective, the change in the number of nurse stations could be seen as exhausting the issue. If you have more team nurse stations, then the nurses will talk more and you'll sort of meet this nursing demand for unfilled capacity to talk with each other. But building on the initial analysis and prior research, we thought that the spatial variables were also important. So it doesn't just matter what's there, like adding nurse stations, but it matters how it's arranged in space. So we were thinking about this in a pretty straightforward way. A plan that is more visually connected and integrated creates conditions for nursing team members to more often be co-visible with each other. And once you have this increased co-visibility, you get the conditions that are necessary for face-to-face communication. And we thought the new unit would be more visually connected. We hadn't tested it in advance, and more visually integrated than the old unit, and that it would also show these signs of more team communication. We also looked at isovis connectivity, a measure developed by Michelle Osman. And in a couple of empirical studies, it's predicted awareness of key locations. And we did the isovis connectivity for the system of team and decentralized nurse stations. I'm going to come back and explain that one in more detail in a bit. We're just dealing with 2 units, so we're not trying to demonstrate causality. The study design is a post-occupancy evaluation. It's a comparative case study of the new and old inpatient unit. So what it can tell us is about whether the new design is working, the efficacy of the new design, and it can also help us accumulate information about the relationship of floor plan layout to care team communication. And at this point, the study team involved me, a couple of designers from BSA, an executive nurse from the hospital, and Kirsten Saylor, our colleague who's on this call. We use DepthMapX to analyze the continuous space of each unit, excluding chases, public bathrooms, stairwells, structural elements, and fixed furniture taller than 5 feet. And the grid size for the analysis was 1 square foot. And what we found was that the new unit had larger view sheds with an average view shed size of 699 square feet compared to 608 in the old unit. You can see the quantile values of view shed sizes at the bottom of this slide. In the old unit, the largest value is near the glass meeting room, which is kind of to the right of the plan around the core at the corner. And for the new unit, the largest values actually occur near each of the 4 nurse stations. For both units, when we get to the 75th percentile, we're talking about the minor corridors in the plan, and the rest is like the various enclosed rooms that are on each unit. The new unit also had lower mean depth values, meaning it was more integrated than the old one. And the difference here was larger than when I was analyzing the two design options. It's 3.34 in the new unit and 3.48 in the old. And the ISOVIS connectivity for the system of team and decentralized nurse stations on the new unit was slightly larger than on the old unit, but the values are pretty close. 1,280 square feet in the new unit and 1,269 in the old. I want to explain ISOVIS connectivity. Even though it was barely different in this analysis, I think these are the kinds of measures that become relevant to hospital settings. So here's an illustration of ISOVIS connectivity in concept, and it, in essence, is the sum of the area of the second order ISOVIS. So what you see here is these are both plans of the old unit, and there are 2 decentralized nurse stations highlighted. And the dark red geometry, they're highlighted in green. The dark red geometry is what's visible from the front of that decentralized nurse station. And then the sort of lighter color is what's visible from the initial ISOVIS. So you can see that there's differences in the size, and ISOVIS connectivity is a size measure. It's just the area of these things. But you can also see in this case, there's differences in the contents. So the nurse station on the left is a larger ISOVIS. It reaches more into the plan, larger ISOVIS connectivity. It reaches more into the plan, but it also happens to pick up the nurse station, where the one on the right is smaller and it's sort of picking up less stuff. So a prior study by Osman found an association between high ISOVIS connectivity values or areas for patient heads of beds in intensive care units and lower patient mortality. So something about this extended visibility polygon was important to the way the patients were being surveilled. And then relatedly, a study by a scholar named Rutali Joshi found that doctors who worked in areas with high ISOVIS connectivity were disrupted more often than ones who are working in areas with smaller ISOVIS connectivity values. So somehow this measure is getting at the significance of awareness that's beyond what's immediately visible, like just beyond what's immediately visible. And we're kind of still theorizing and testing why or how this seems to be relevant. It's kind of sitting between connectivity and integration if you're thinking in a VGA way about it. Okay, but back to data collection. So we have a new unit. It's more visually connected. It's more visually integrated. The other thing we wanted to look at was nurse communication on these 2 units. We used 3 measures: behavior mapping, a validated survey, and social network analysis. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll just dispense with the survey quickly. We had a decent response rate, but there were not any notable differences between the units. And this lack of difference is contradicted by the other 2 kinds of data collection that we did. So for the behavior mapping, I walked circuits through the main hallway loop and recorded only the staff, like their position, and whether or not they were talking. 16 rounds over 2 days during the day shift. I was the only reporter, so inter-rater reliability was not an issue. Um, what we want to learn from the behavior mapping is the per unit prevalence of talking, but also how the care team spreads itself out over the floor. We found on the new unit that there was a greater proportion of nursing staff engaged in talking. It was 46% in the new unit and 33% in the old unit. And what is more is that on the old unit, the presence of nurse staff, so just how they were spread out in space, and also where they were talking was really concentrated in that left quadrant. Whereas in the new unit, it was still kind of concentrated in that left quadrant. That's where you come on and off the unit, but it was more spread out. So we did this by calculating densities of presence and densities of talking for each of those 4 quadrants, just taking a per area measure. So numerator was the total number of people observed, and denominator was 1,000 square feet. And then we looked at the ranges, so a smaller range would mean that there's more diffusion of the nursing staff across the space, and a larger range would mean that it's much more concentrated in one area. So this was great because if we think about our earlier conversation about nurse work having to deal with this tension of getting pulled toward the patient and pulled toward the team, it looks like the design of the new unit is doing a better job supporting nurses to do both, to be proximal to their patient while still having opportunities to stay connected to the care team. We also did some social network analysis. Kirsten was really important to this. This was my first use of this analytical method. We did this by asking members of the nursing team to complete paper-based questionnaires at the end of their 12-hour day shifts. And these are social network analyses of communication networks. We selected the shifts, so we got as good of a coverage of the whole roster of people who work there without too much overlap. And what the questionnaire looked like was a list of everybody who worked on that shift, plus this question: how often did you discuss patient care with each of these individuals face to face while working on your unit during the current shift? And people could answer never, rarely, sometimes, frequently, and constantly. So here's the network density. Network density is a whole network measure that characterizes the degree to which a network approaches the condition of all talk to all. It measures communication cohesion within a given setting. So low network density indicates that people are talking to few others, and a maximally high network density of 100% would mean that each person talks to every other. For the new unit, which is pictured on the left, network densities for any discussion of patient care, so that means responses other than "I never talked to this person," came to an average density of 73%. And for the old unit, those network densities came to an average just above 60. This was over a couple of days. For both of the units, these are pretty dense networks, which is consistent with the information and communication-rich nature of inpatient care and inpatient nurse work. The new unit, obviously, more so. So these particular sociograms are from the first day on each unit. But when we go and talk about the communication about patients that was characterized as frequent or constant, the new unit, those densities became 34.5%, averaged over 2 days. And the old unit, it was 18%. So roughly half as many people are saying, "I talk to people," roughly half as many people were talking to people frequently or constantly about patient care. So the new unit has more dense communication networks and a notably greater relative difference when we're talking about frequent or constant communication. We also looked at in degree, and in degree is like the incoming communications that are reported for an individual. So if I say that I talked to somebody, that person kind of gets a point of in degree. In degree is taken to reflect the influence or the importance of individuals in the network because it tells us how often that person is cited as being someone that someone else sought out for communication. In addition to just looking at in degree in general, we looked at differences in degree by two main care team worker types: registered nurses, which are RNs, and patient care assistants, PCAs. And these are sometimes called nursing assistants. So for any communication, the RNs and the PCAs on the new unit both had much higher in degree than the old unit. It's like it's 3 point. It's listed there below below the images. Um, and what we did have an interesting reversal for frequent or constant communication, which is what the graph is here. The PCAs on the old unit break the pattern with higher in degree than everyone else on either unit. And the paper in Connections goes into more detailed discussion of this, but it looks like the PCAs are important links that prevent social networks from fragmenting. In these sociograms, the PCAs are the pink, and the size of the node has to do with the amount of in degree coming at them. The RNs are blue, and everybody else is yellow. So if you look at the sociogram of the old unit on the right, you can see like two little blue squares up to the left, and that is two nurses who nobody reported talking to. um, but you can also see there's a couple instances where the pink squares are either really enriching the density of the network, if not, in the case sort of toward the left, preventing it from fragmenting. So I think there's more to unpack around like kind of the intricacies of roles and interactions in nurse work. But in sum, the new unit, which was programmed and spatially designed to promote care team connections, has larger, more integrated view sheds. It also had larger ISFIS connectivity values, indicating more visual exposure and more robust visual connection between the nurse stations and the rest of the unit. Care team communication is important for patients, and in this case, members of the care team specifically requested a design that would support greater ease of care team connection. And then the design team responded by creating a more visually open unit with large, evenly distributed, sensibly located care team stations for care team members to work together. On that more visually open unit, we had a more even distribution of care team workers. They verbally communicated with one another more frequently, and we both observed this in behavior mapping and saw it in the SNA, the social network analysis questionnaire. I think there are two kind of overriding ideas that are pointed to here. One is that we should design for nurse work as knowledge work. It's not knowledge work all the time. Sometimes they're putting hands on the patient, we're delivering things, but part of it is knowledge work, and that's essential. The second is that corridors are the area of the nurse work knowledge spaces, and corridors in hospitals can be this maligned entity. They're thought of as just like we need to be able to get beds past each other, but other than that, every square foot in a hospital is expensive to build, and the corridor makes no money. Like an operating room, every square foot of operating room makes money. The corridor makes no money, but it is the sort of knowledge work space for nurses, and it has a value that's important to the quality and the safety of patient care. There's a couple limitations of this study. In hospitals, the reality is that certain operational conditions matter a lot, if not the most. Staffing ratios, how many nurses per patient, licensure rates, how well trained are your nurses, probably in most cases matter more than design, assuming a building is to code. Also, both of the units that I've compared are serving medical surgical patients, but the new unit serves also progressive care patients. So it's a mix of med-surg patients and slightly more acute patients. And the higher acuity of these patients could drive some of the increased communication. So basically, the more complex the patient, the more there is to talk about. And that also might describe why the PCAs, the patient care assistants, are taking a more prominent role in the old unit where their acuity is a little bit lower. I'm just starting a study of ICUs and ICUs only that I'll use some of these methods again, and that will help us understand more about what's going on here. So I just want to close by reflecting on the title of the presentation because I meant it in two ways. So like, let the nurses talk. First, the nurses, the hospitals, and the designers, and I all worked toward a unit design that would quite literally let the nurses talk by not dampening communication by isolating the nurse workspace. But also let the nurses talk relates to a central idea from feminist standpoint epistemology. And standpoint epistemology notes that individuals and groups of lower status sometimes hold better information about the societies that they inhabit compared to higher placed individuals and groups. And that's because they need that information to survive. So an example that's often talked about in philosophy is if there's a mixed gender workplace and it's managed mostly by hetero cis men, and if you want to know if there's sexual harassment in that workplace, you will probably get better information if you ask the women employees than if you ask the men in management. And so this is the second register of let the nurses talk. And that's the idea that if we wish to intervene on the world by design, it's really important to proceed with good information. There's a lot of noise around what nurses are supposed to act like and what they need at work and kind of how they're supposed to perform virtue. And here, a kernel of the information that we used in the design came from the nurses who used the space. And it was based on that use that they were in a good position to say what the space needed to do. And it was important for us to listen. All right, thank you.